bit of a treat for you today. We are going to be talking about the neighborhood that was the original port of the nation's capital, became its own municipality in the 1800s, and then in the 1900s it kind of turned into ground zero for the preppy set in the 80s, and then in the later part of the 80s was hosting the sort of punk movement that was going on in DC, and then in the 90s kind of became the alternative and grunge headquarters here in DC, and it sort of lives on to become one of the most expensive neighborhoods in DC with a prestige unmatched by any other neighborhood for the most part, and that neighborhood is Georgetown. So I am Melissa.
I'm Michael.
And this is what we are going to talk about today. We're going to give you a little bit of Georgetown, talk about the history, and then go into some real estate and talk about what kinds of houses are here for you to buy. So I thought that this was going to be super boring just because I live so close to Georgetown, and I seem to struggle when I try to think of I want to go eat somewhere, and it's like Georgetown doesn't pop to the top of my head.
Yeah.
But then as I dove into it, I actually wanted to slap myself for not paying a deeper attention, because the restaurants have sort of moved, and we'll talk about this when we go through restaurants in a separate video, but they've moved off of M Street, but they still exist in the neighborhood, and all these little gems still exist in Georgetown that you don't necessarily expect are there, but you do have to kind of go looking for them.
Yeah, the rents have just become too high, so they've kind of dispersed in and out around, and so it's kind of like an adventure, and the food scene is really reviving itself as well in Georgetown. So it's becoming, they've been talking a lot about how it's becoming more of a spot.
Yeah, very cool. All right, so location. So this is basically the Northwest Quadrant of DC. It's probably one of the furthest most south, along with Foggy Bottom, but it borders the Potomac River. You've got Rock Creek Park on the east, essentially. Part of it that comes down. And then it's sort of bordered, Reservoir Road is the north. That's where Georgetown Hospital is. And then you've got Glover Archibold Park on the west side, and that sort of separates it from Foxhall and Palisades neighborhoods. And so you're sort of tucked in there right along the Potomac River. The history of Georgetown, as we sort of alluded to in the introduction, is very, very fascinating. And it's one that we don't really want to gloss over because there's a lot that's happened here. So the founding of Georgetown actually predates the founding of DC as the nation's capital. So it was the only area in DC originally with settlers. There were slaves here too, and so we're going to talk about that a little bit more later. It was a separate municipality until 1871, at which time Congress deemed that it was now going to become part of the whole city. So within the next couple of decades, Georgetown kind of saw that any local ordinances that they had were removed because they were now part of the rest of the city. Their street names had to be changed to coincide with the rest of the city as well. And so that's some sort of say that whole we're not part of you and we're not part of the rest of the city still exists today. And there's certain things that people think, right? So our did you know is that there's a longstanding rumor in DC that Georgetown didn't want the metro because of
race issues
and crime, right? So, and that's actually not true. So they did look into bringing metro here, but they could not do it because they would have had to do so much infrastructure and underpinning to the houses that it would have the structural integrity would have been compromised for all of these houses. So that was really why they didn't do it. And I think for whatever reason, Georgetown got that reputation of, the fancy Georgetown people didn't want the metro there because they didn't want it to bring the crime and the bad element that rides the metro.
It's crazy.
All right, so we're going to show right now, we've got a photo of Wisconsin and M Street facing east in the early 1900s. So we're going to show that, and then we're going to let that go against the one that is for today, the same view of Wisconsin and M Streets facing east. So let's jump to the 1970s. Georgetown this is sort of a little bit of the beginnings of its heyday, right? There was a lot of thrift shops and kind of hipster, pre-hipster, I guess, and hippie stores and stuff like that. And so record shops, all of that stuff. And then in the 80s, it really turned into the place to see and be seen. So at that time, Maryland and Virginia were changing their drinking age from 18 to 21. And DC did not jump onto that bandwagon until 1986. Guess which mayor supported the raising of the drinking age from 18 to 21?
Marion Barry.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's almost an easy guess because he had 4 terms here, but yeah. So, anyway, the city was kind of flooded in the 80s with kids in their, 18, 19, 20, like late teens, because they could still drink here. And so the Georgetown streets were gridlocked in the 80s. Yeah. And if you want like a really, like what I think is a really good representation of what Georgetown was like in the 80s, St. Elmo's Fire. Good bits of it were filmed here. My brother was at Georgetown at the time they were filming. Georgetown University did not want the association with St. Elmo's Fire because they felt like that's not really our student, and it probably wasn't, but there was probably some, it was showing like a very like upper middle class yuppie contingent of people, some with drug issues, some with family issues, but it was very representative, I think, of the 80s and Georgetown at that time.
Yeah.
And so did you know that do you remember the Preppy handbook?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So they actually named Clyde's as like the definitive preppy bar in DC.
Yeah.
And Clyde's actually opened in 1963 in what used to be like a motorcycle hangout. Yeah. And then they built the first full-size bar in the city since Prohibition.
Really?
Yeah.
I never knew that.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
I know. There's all kinds of crazy fun history about Georgetown.
Yeah.
All right, so the mid-1980s was the punk movement. Yes. Now we're getting into this would be like your time frame where you might start to remember stuff.
Yes.
Michael's a little bit younger than I am.
Yeah, I mean, I remember a lot of this, especially growing up here. Yeah. In the 80s and 90s, like those decades, and what Georgetown is really cool.
Yeah, a lot of the major players of like that punk movement lived in Georgetown, Glover Park, and some of them were even like in Upper Northwest. Yeah. But this was really like a stomping ground for them. They hung out in Georgetown. Some of them worked in Georgetown. Yeah. Henry Rollins worked at the Haagen-Dazs that was on Wisconsin Avenue. Yeah. It's very, very cool.
Yeah, it's one of those things that I always encourage people to research because, like, when they talk about music in DC, a lot of it is just thought of as like jazz, but the punk scene was just incredible.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And the where they can start their research?
Where?
With the video that Leah Mercina and I did on the punks. The whole punk scene. I will occasionally get these comments from people that are like, oh, you summed this up so well. Yeah. But I read a couple books to be able to put that video together. So, so we've got a video on punk. You'll be able to tell from the thumbnail because my hair is like purple for it. The girls and I, we dressed for the video. So in the 80s, the rest of the city was experiencing a crime wave. Georgetown was like somewhat a respite from the rest of the city. It wasn't really like feeling that sort of like the gun violence and the drug violence and the things that were coming with everything there. In the 90s was when kind of the grunge and alternative era hit. And you would hear, alt music coming out of some of these clubs as well. And then at this point in time, the nightlife really started to also shift to Adams Morgan. And that's when people started to pay more attention to Adams Morgan as well as a nightlife area.
Yeah.
And then for Georgetown, the national chains and the high-end hotels started coming in. And that really began like a new definition of Georgetown, which sort of is like what people still think of it as today.
Yeah, I mean, and that's a lot of too, like with, the go-go scene and jazz scene, and just the music scene in general, a lot of it was dispersed because of a lot of the clubs just closed because of high-end restaurants and hotels and things like that. It just, it changed the whole scene.
Yeah, there was a whole too, I didn't plan on talking about this, but there was Georgetown students that used to take over like a restaurant sort of on the eastern edge of Georgetown, it was a restaurant and they weren't doing well and they turned it into like a club at night. So there was all kinds of that kind of stuff going on and happening all over the place.
Yeah.
So in the past 10 years though, we can kind of talk about what's happened to Georgetown. A lot of the stores have closed, like Michael said. A lot of them relocated to other parts of the city. Yeah. 14th Street became another area in Logan Circle where people wanted to be. And so a lot of these stores, some relocated over there, some opened second locations over there and still maintained like another location in Georgetown on M Street. The rents are they just got too high. And we saw that for a lot of businesses.
Yeah. And we also have a lot of new places that are, spawning, in different neighborhoods, like Union Market has taken over a lot of that, and there's a lot of actually a lot of clothing shops and things like that are popping up over there now.
Right.
So it's just kind of been dispersed throughout the city, just because only the big corporations can generally afford to pay these rents.
Right, and that makes sense because that's who you see here. Is you see like these stores, you'll see like Lululemon and Aerie and the big national chains that are still here and maintain a presence in Georgetown, and they may have locations in other parts of the city, or you might see more mom and pop shops in smaller places in other parts of the city because they can't maintain a place in Georgetown because the rent is just too high.
Yeah, one of the things I've been noticing as well is that a lot of the internet-based clothing companies have been opening stores in Georgetown as well. So I've been noticing that popping up on M Street a lot.
Yeah, like there's a rent the runway there, and you can go in and there's a selection of things you could get, but you could also return things there. There was an Amazon bookstore and shop, and that closed down. It's gone.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's definitely sort of always in flux. I wouldn't say it's got its best look happening right now. There's a lot of for lease signs and things in the windows. But there is still quite a bit there. You know, Marcina and I went down there yesterday to get her little graduation gift from elementary school. My baby's growing up. So yeah, all right. So, and then I would say the customer base in Georgetown is just as much tourist as it is local. Might be more tourist than local.
It's more tourist than local. Yeah, I think a lot of us have started to venture back in because of the restaurants. Mm-hmm. But a lot of it is tourists.
Yeah. All right, and so then big scandal in 2021, archaeologists actually discovered the remains of 28 African Americans believed to be slaves from the early 1800s buried in Georgetown. So we're going to talk now. One of the biggest residents of Georgetown is Georgetown University.
Yes.
And they were founded by Jesuits, but it has come to light in the past several years that the university also has ties to slavery. Couple ways that they did. First, they have big donors who were living on Maryland plantations, and that really, like, all that money kind of fortified the university and got it to where it is.
Yeah.
And so it's money that was really made because of slavery. They wouldn't have been able to make that money on their plantations if it wasn't for slavery. The second and kind of more outrageous tie to slavery happened in 1838, when two presidents of the university, in a quest to raise money for the school and keep the school solvent, sold 272 slaves to plantation owners in Louisiana. Yeah. Now, why would this be discovered? Well, the school was actually going to name a couple buildings after those presidents and people who organized the sale. And then students went and did some research and found out, hey, they were actually responsible for the sale of these slaves, and we should not be naming these buildings after them. So that's how all of that came to light.
Yeah. It's I remember reading all about it and the extensive research that was done.
Yeah. All right. So, real estate. Should we talk real estate?
Yeah. I love the real estate in Georgetown.
I know, it's a wild ride.
It is.
Georgetown. All right. So there are single-family detached houses. How many are there?
No idea.
Yeah, there's not many.
There are not many.
There's not many. There are also one-bedroom row homes here, and they're on the smaller side streets, right?
I love them. They're so cute. I was in one about a year and a half ago. Because it was behind, some of my clients were buying a property.
Yes.
The house was right behind it.
Yes.
Yeah, and it went on and I was like, I have to see this.
Yes. Yeah. No, and that's exactly, so they're like 500 to 800 square feet.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think history probably tells us that those were either servants' quarters or slave housing or something like that, right?
Yeah.
Like they were, and there's probably like a whole family of 10 people that lived in that one-bedroom house.
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy. I mean, in the 8th Street neighborhood where my house is, and it's small, it was marketed to families. It was only 2 bedrooms.
Yeah.
And 1 bathroom, so.
You can own your little slice of Georgetown.
Yeah, it's cool, though. I mean, it's an alternative to condo living, especially because, the condos are expensive in Georgetown. So, it's really fun. I love those little small 1-bedroom houses.
Right.
They're so fascinating.
Right. All right. And then I was going to because this is one of the areas where we see housing that actually is built in the 1800s, because it is the oldest part of the city. Side note here. So we take continuing ed classes with historic preservation, and they have routinely told us that there was a fire in DC land records in the late 1800s. Yeah. And so a lot of times you'll look at these houses and the tiny little 1-bedroom houses, and they're all going to say they were built in 1900. And somebody might think, geez, they really built a lot in 1900. No, they had to guess. So when they went and assigned a year, everybody just started arbitrarily putting 1900 as the year built on a lot of these homes. But you can tell by, some of them are like they're shifted like this. Like, you know that they are not from 1900. They are like well in the 1800s at some point.
Yeah, I mean, I even found an error in the land records with my own house. They say it's built in 1916, but when I did my research and through the Library of Congress and the newspaper, I actually found the original record, and they were fully constructed in 1915 and were advertising them. So I actually have the original advertisement for my house.
Yeah, ours is off like that too. Like, there's actually a couple of people, like ours we thought was 1932, and a couple of our neighbors actually are like third generation in Glover Park, and they're like, no, my grandfather said that yours were built in 1936. So it's kind of interesting that how it happens. But yeah, it's land records are, I had a client that worked in land records in the tax offices and stuff, and they were like, if you saw what goes on there, you would understand why all the information is like suspect.
Yeah, it's crazy.
So many of the homes there are from the 1800s. It's just that it's going to be rare to find something on paper that proves it.
Yeah.
All right, so most house prices start in, what price point would you say?
1 million.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So most prices are in the 1 millions. For 2,000 square feet house, you're probably going to pay $2 million for it. Like, it's every bit of $1,000 a square foot for buying real estate in Georgetown. And prices kind of climb steadily to the $5 million price point. And then you do have houses and properties that are priced beyond that into the tens of millions or more. They're usually the very unique houses or the ones that have history. Like right now, the house that the Kennedys lived in is on the market by our brokerage, and it's I think they started at 26 million, but they've come down a little bit from there. But they're usually, you're gonna get a unique house with a lot of history, and there's an element of owning it that's just beyond the financial. It's that whole like priceless
prestige.
You've got this house that the Kennedys lived in, and pictures of them in their backyard, and then you can take the same picture of you in your backyard. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's whenever anybody talks about DC or the DC area, it's Georgetown and Old Town. Yeah. Those are what everybody knows about.
Old Town, Alexandria. Yeah.
They'll have a reference.
Yeah, because they are the oldest neighborhoods.
Yeah.
And then there are condos here. So there's a couple different places you'll find condos. There's a co-op building as well. So condos, the ones on the waterfront are, they are spendy.
Yeah, they are. They're so cool. I love them, but wow.
But a lot of them are like from the 80s too, so they're definitely like an 80s special, like you're like, man, it's like a little bit too much like marble in this kitchen floor for me. It was, there's you can kind of revisit what the fancy 80s were like by looking at some of those condos in Georgetown. You'll pay over $1 million to live on the side of the building that faces the Potomac River. Yeah. You might be able to pay $600,000 for the side that faces the Whitehurst Freeway, which is not as appealing. Yeah. But you're all going to have the same condo fees in those buildings, and those condo fees are a lot. So I've had I sold one in 3030 Water Street, and those condo fees are like $5,000 a month. And so people are like, wait, what? Yes, because there's concierge, there's people that help you bring your groceries up, and all that costs money and has to be paid for.
Yeah, that's what it caters to, and so you're going to pay for it.
Yeah. So, all right. So that was sort of the history and real estate about Georgetown. Hope you enjoyed that. We have another video which is going to talk more about like the fun lifestyle stuff, the food and all of that. That's like Michael's forte. We just ate at one of the restaurants we're going to talk about the other day, so we're very excited about that. So check that video out. And if you have any questions about Georgetown real estate, our contact info is coming next.